was something magical about the Game Boy Advance. Of the many handhelds that I've owned over the years, it's the one with which I've spent by far the least amount of time, and yet it's one that's near the top of my list when it comes to naming my all-time favorites. Link's Awakening was originally a Game Boy game that was later enhanced on the Game Boy Color, and then kind of lay dormant for nearly 21 years. But now Link's Awakening has been remade for Switch and released alongside the new miniaturized Switch Lite. And despite having never been officially made for the GBA, the combination of Link's Awakening and the Switch Lite has ripped me back to my days of angling my GBA just right in the third row of my parents' Land Cruiser to be able to see those nearly Super Nintendo graphics on that terrible screen. Conceptually, I adore Link's Awakening. Its unique deviation from the Zelda formula and obviously catered for handheld design language, combined with the nostalgic form factor of the Switch Lite, makes for the best Game Boy experience I've ever had, and it's not even on a Game Boy. Welcome everyone. Welcome back to LegalSpeak, a Cold North production. I'm the Law Morris, and this is the video essay series in which I get to talk about the games I've been playing and what I think of the medium as a whole. I've been playing a new to me Zelda adventure over the past couple weeks, so let's talk about that. The Zelda series started as a top-down 2D adventure game in 1987, and for the first 4 entries it would remain that way. In 1998, Zelda broke into the third dimension with Ocarina of Time to massive critical acclaim. But just 3 years later, the franchise would go back to its 2D roots, and contrary to traditional thinking, Nintendo has kept Zelda alive in both the second and third dimensions as a distinctly different, but equally good variations of the same series. With well over a dozen entries behind them, Nintendo has continued to iterate and improve upon the gameplay featured in both the 2D and 3D Zeldas, and after playing through Link's Awakening on Switch, it's easy to say that this is as good as 2D Zelda has ever been. Movement across Koholint Island is pleasant and intricate, with puzzles and item gates along the way, that lead to portions of the island being blocked off for the majority of the game. There are secrets to be discovered almost everywhere, and in many cases even secrets within secrets offering even more to explore. Combat is responsive and has finally overcome that silly feeling of having to offset Link from his attackers in order to ensure contact with the swing of the sword in all but the most extreme scenarios. The items that Link uses are enjoyable and satisfying, but a bit limited in number and scope. Where the hookshot is often used as an option for stunning most enemies in other games, it feels extremely contextual in Link's Awakening, offering the same functionality the Zelda audience has come to expect, but in a much more limited capacity. The bow and arrow is really only utilized in a combat scenario in the Ancient Ruins, and a puzzle scenario in the Face Shrine, whereas in other entries, it's a stable for players to lean on heavily in ranged combat situations. The actual combat and movement are at an all-time high for the 2D games, but the game having been designed originally for a 2-button interface feels as though it was designed to not utilize items to nearly the same extent as A Link to the Past before it and almost all subsequent games. Overall, the design of the game is excellent. The overworld is charming and enthralling, while the dungeons feel well plotted and for the most part logical. Koholint Island isn't the biggest overworld of any Zelda game ever, and in fact it's almost certainly one of the smallest. But where Koholint Island shines is in the density and complexity. The developers used a winding path and varying levels of verticality to make the world feel much larger than it actually is. Through clever map design, the player can both see where they need to go and be a 3 to 4 minute journey from that point as they have to wind their way around the labyrinth that is Koholint Island to reach their destination. The island itself is a gigantic puzzle that continues to leave the player wondering until after hours of playtime it can be completely mastered. From a design standpoint alone, Koholint Island is one of the biggest assets the game has to offer. Dungeon designs are a bit less satisfying. Early on, the dungeons are fine, but as the game progresses and the difficulty curve ramps up, the developers leaned more and more heavily on frustratingly unintuitive design to create an illusion of difficulty. Some particularly frustrating points of the game occurred when the player is left not knowing what to do with almost no hint pushing them in the right direction. As the game continues, this becomes increasingly common, and left me with little choice than to look up where to go just to be able to continue. Typically, I try not to use a guide, as I think it makes for a fundamentally different experience than figuring it out for yourself. Not worse or any less valid, just different. But I'm also not willing to beat my head against the wall trying to figure out something that I may have just missed or may be a result of a simple lapse in cohesive game design, so I'm willing to turn to a guide when necessary. I've played plenty of Zeldas, and I'm well versed in their puzzle mechanics. But as I got further into the game, I found myself having to refer to a guide more and more frequently. And when seeing the next step, I was left wondering how I was supposed to know that. Essentially, it feels as though for the sake of longevity, the devs created something that began to feel artificially long and not fully realized. Into the later dungeons and overworld exploration, Link's Awakening starts to feel distinctly like a Game Boy game, but kind of in a bad way. But while it may not be the best designed Zelda game in the last 30 plus years, it is definitely one of the best Zelda stories, as the player is forced to repeatedly backtrack across the world and speak with all the inhabitants of the world, learning about them personally and seeing them in their own home environments. They can't help but fall in love with not only the people, but their environment. Koholint Island is shockingly alive feeling compared to other Game Boy games, and even home console games of the era. There are constantly things happening across the island that have nothing to do with the main story, which contributes to the feeling of this being a world that exists and raises the stakes of the main quest. From the outset of the game, Link and the player alike aren't given much context as to why they're doing what they're doing, but they really press forward regardless. Early in the game, there are different things hinting at the twist ending, but towards the end, the dungeon bosses blatantly tell both Link and the player that this is all just a dream, and if Link wakes the Windfish, it will all be over. Having known the ending of the game prior to playing this version, every time one of the bosses warned me about this, it was a bit more heartbreaking. Here I was, moving throughout these dungeons as though this was any other Zelda game. But for the first time in the series, Link's actions have significant negative consequences. Operating under the assumption that we're doing the right thing without taking the time to look around at what we're doing can lead to grave mistakes. And that's what Link's Awakening seemed to be and should have been all about. Link and the player are the villain of this story, and it just goes to show that even an ignorant villain is still a villain regardless. Where I felt the story went off the rails a bit was in trying to vilify the nightmares at the end. That story beat wasn't earned and just devalued the masterful storytelling the game had set up previously at the last minute, in a feeble attempt to present Link as the hero. Conceptually, I love Link's Awakening. It's a great 2D Zelda experience, and the remake continues to shine an already excellent gameplay experience. For better or worse, it is undeniably and unapologetically a remake of a Game Boy game from more than 20 years ago, and that shows. But despite its flaws, the Switch version of this game offers up a complete and enjoyable Zelda experience. Link's Awakening's deviation from the typical Zelda story arc helps it stand out, in my opinion, as the second best Zelda story, with just a minor hiccup that's easily ignored at the end. It's not my favorite Zelda. In fact, I'm not sure where it lands on the spectrum of Zelda games for me, but I can definitely see a case for it being made for it being in the top 5. What are your thoughts on this new old Zelda? And which old Zelda would you like to see be new next? Let me know in the comments down below. Also, shout out to Bounty Hunter 115. Thanks for your support. I'd be glad to have you on the podcast sometime, so just leave a comment on this video. Don't forget to check out everything we do all in one spot over at coldnorthpro.com. I'll be back next week talking about something else. Maybe Sega, maybe something Gears of War related. I'm really not sure yet. So until then, just go play some games.